Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Evoke Family or the Evoke Therapy Podcast. I'm Dr. Reedy. Today is March 23rd, 2022. Tonight's broadcast is going to be part one of a two-parter. Oftentimes, when I review a book, especially books that have several chapters that aren't on the same topic, it's going to require me to split them into more than one broadcast. So the next time that we have a topic, which will be in after the next question and answer, I'm going to talk about part two. So I'm really excited to get to this. For those of you who don't know, JD Gill is my therapist, has been for 23 years now. She's written a host of books. I think most of them are showing on this slide. All of her books are available on Amazon. In fact, something kind of interesting, she just joined Instagram. So if you're an Instagrammer, you can find her at Dr. JD Gill as her handle on Instagram. So this is a series of essays. The title of it is called Context, and the beginning of the book talks about context in a broader sense. There's a lot of social issues that she talks about and addresses in her book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time or much time on those because that's not the focus of what we talk about. We talk about psychology, relationships, kind of talking about it in terms of its application to our family and our relationships. So I'm not going to talk about its societal implications like JD does. I will also say, as a lead into this, of all the books that I've read of hers, and I've read most of them, this one's more advanced in terms of its thinking. It's more challenging in terms of its thinking. I was just discussing this with Malia, my moderator, as we were beginning, and she was guessing maybe it's because of her age, and it does have that feel. She's getting to a point in her life where she's just writing what it is without trying to kind of soften its landing into the hearts of the people that read it. So this would not be my recommendation to beginners. I would recommend some of her other books, Forms of Life. I would recommend. What else is there that's good? I would recommend Finding Human. I would recommend Letters of Juliet before this. I think Seeing is another good one for beginners. I think those would be better if you're wanting to get into Jamie's work. Having said all of that, with all of those qualifications, Jamie has been my greatest teacher. She goes by JD when she writes. Jamie has been my greatest teacher, and so much of what I do is influenced by her work, and I'm really happy to share with you this evening some of her work. I love this beginning to the book. Under chapter 1, this is the epigraph for chapter 1. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of the author, so if you're watching it, you can see it, but it's a small little piece of prose. And it goes like this. It says, "Come to the edge," he said. "We can't, we're afraid," they responded. "Come to the edge," he said. "We can't, we will fall," they responded. "Come to the edge," he said. And so they came, and he pushed them, and they flew. I had up here a quote by the poet David White before we began, for those of you that were sitting in the waiting room before the broadcast began. And he explained something, or this quote, I think, spoke to this same kind of sentiment in a slightly different way. He writes, "The marvelous peculiarity about admitting to being lost is that we have come to our senses. We wake up. We look around with a keenness we did not have before." As you begin your journey listening to these podcasts or doing your own work, one thing I will encourage you is just to keep listening. If anything strikes you, if there's any ray of sunshine coming through the clouds of what I'm talking about and what I'm teaching about, if anything strikes you and hits you, it is to keep listening. So many listeners, and I'm getting more and more listeners reaching out to me through various forms, social media, emails, tell me this, that as they listen for a few months, they begin to understand what I'm talking about. And I think the reason that is, it relates to the book of Context, is I'm talking about it from a fairly advanced context. I'm talking about it with at least an expectation that some of the basic ideas, the assumptions in psychology are shared. And I know that that's not true. I just want to say that. I know that that's not true, but that's the context in which I'm speaking. And this quote in the David White poem that I just read to you, or the David White quote that I just read to you, is we have to come. I say this about our students in the field. We have to come up against our realization that our old ways of thinking, our old ways of operating were futile. We have to come, to grow in enlightenment and awareness. We have to first go through a destructive process where we unlearn things that we were learned, that we were taught, and that we took for granted. Even they were so inherent, intrinsic in our context growing up that we couldn't even see them. And I'll talk about that when I go over the essay on blindness. And so, if you're new or newer to this work and it strikes you, I just continue to encourage you to continue listening. And after a while, you'll begin to hear things, especially if you're doing your own work. You'll begin to hear things, and things will make more and more sense to you. The premise or the starting place for tonight's broadcast and for Jamie's book is this quote in their first chapter. She says, by far, the most important context in our lives is language. And I thought about this a lot as I was preparing for this broadcast. There's so much of therapy that's about language. When I talk or when I teach, I'll often say to people, I'm going to choose my words very, very precisely. For example, it's going to be extraordinarily rare that you'll hear me use the word should, unless I'm using it in that type of sentence where I'm making a point about the word. But it's not in my nature to think of things as ought or should. And yet, when I hear myself quoted, anywhere from a 16-year-old adolescent boy in the wilderness to a parent coach, coaching client, to an intensive group, to social media, when I hear myself quoted, I hear a lot of shoulds. And I don't think in those terms. And I choose very, very intentionally to avoid anything that sounds like an ought. But because of our blindness, which I'll talk about as we go along, because of our context, because of our background, because of the mother tongue that we were taught, which is this imparting of the way it is, that's just the way it is kind of thinking. We can't hear new information, new ideas, new concepts without attaching a should or an ought to them. But this work is really the antithesis of should and ought. So language matters. It gives us meaning, and it needs to be understood in the context. And that's why, going back to what I was saying at the outset of this broadcast, give it a chance. After a while, after you start to feel yourself into this context, then what I'm teaching and talking about are going to make more sense. Every slide that I show you today will be a quote from J.D. Gill's book, Contexts. So I'm going to go through a series of slides on more than half of the chapters today, more than half of the essays. And I'm going to read the quote from Jamie's book, from J.D.'s book, and then I'm going to expand on it a little bit. And let's start with this quote. This is actually the third one of the broadcast, but let's go on to this quote. She writes, things make sense within contexts. It is therefore important when attempting to understand something or someone to understand the context in which they live and have lived. And really, I'm going to talk about this a lot tonight. That's really what psychotherapy asks of us. It asks us to look back into our context. Again, the things that we take for granted. I can remember early on in my work with Jamie in psychotherapy, I can remember saying things that I thought virtually that all of us shared, ideas, concepts, beliefs that all of us shared, and her looking at me with an incredulous look, with a look of curiosity or confusion. And I thought at the time she was playing some kind of game with me that of course she knows that. The example that I gave to her earlier on was, I know how to make somebody fall in love with you. You just put their needs ahead of yours and they'll fall in love with you. And I wasn't saying it from a very proud place, like I'd found the key to the universe. I was saying it in kind of a defeatist perspective or context, that I didn't think that I could be in relationships with other human beings where I valued and at times prioritized my own needs and wants and still be loved. And Jamie just said something very simple to me. She said, I think it's possible for you to take care of yourself and still be loved. And I remember thinking, is she playing a mind game with me? That's obviously not true. But really what she was doing, and this is the thesis of the book, or at least the book title context, is she was standing outside of my context. And I was bringing to her kind of an unconscious core belief from my family of origin and laying it on the table in front of us. And she was saying, I don't see the world that way. That's not the way the world is. That might be the way your family was. And as she makes the point throughout this book, we make the assumption that the way things were in our life, in our city, in our home, in our family, we make the assumption that that's the way the world works. And part of psychotherapy and other transformative processes, and she talks a lot about traveling to other cultures and visiting other cultures, part of the process of therapy in those other contexts is that it's only outside of our own context can we get some clarity about what happened to us. When I share, I've told this to you many times, when I share with teenage boys, which was in my wilderness therapist days, was my primary caseload. When I would share this with young men, they would look at me when I would make this point that it would be okay to take care of yourself and that's something that can be valued. They would look at me and overtly say to me, nobody thinks that way. That's just not true. And so I've come to realize that that's a very common lie that we are told or that we are taught, that to rebel or to stand up to authority is some kind of narcissistic instance, is what J.D. Gill calls it. When in reality, it's just a part of becoming who you are, but to be kept in place, to make it the load easier or lighter for the authority figures in our life, our parents, i.e. our parents. We are in essence in this way shamed out of connecting to ourselves and taking care of ourselves. She writes, it requires learning a great deal about the context in which others live. If one is to be able to put oneself in another's place, one needs to know about the place to be entered. When you think about your children, and not all of my listeners are thinking about this what I do in the terms of parenting, but I will say this because I've been thinking about this a lot this week. Really, the podcast and even the books that I write that are about parenting, they're really for parents or for children of parents, which is essentially the rest of us. I think sometimes because I talk about it in the context of parenting, people, at least on the surface, who don't have children might think that it doesn't apply to them. But we were all children of parents at one point, of caregivers at one point. We all are children of parents and caregivers, even to this day, no matter how old we are. And understanding the dynamics and the processes that occur between a parent and child are critical to us understanding ourselves. An inside view, again, this is her idea about context that she talks about and teaches a lot about. An inside view and an outside view are never the same. Salt Lake City doesn't look the same from Salt Lake City as it does from Rome. For this reason, another person will always be able to see things about us that we are unable to see. The reason that this quote stuck out to me in the book and is so important to me is because the core of my audience, the core of the people watching, at least the vast majority of the people watching live, because that's only the Evoke clients, are parents and are coming to these broadcasts in the context of being parents. And sometimes parents will say to me, I love my child the most. I know them the best. And there are, of course, no good arguments against that love part of it, the equation. It's you can't compete with a mother or a father who loves their child for the amount of love that they feel for the child. It's an impossible comparison. They're right about that. But that doesn't make you see them clearly. And even if you see things about them that other people don't, you also don't see things about them that other people can, because you're in it. I've learned this recently in a very vivid way, and I didn't even want to admit this to myself, but I've shared with you all many times that one of the things that my family and I do together is we talk a lot about psychology at night, psychological ideas. There are 4 therapists in the family that are formal therapists, and there are, all of the family members are inclined toward therapy and therapeutic ideas. And recently we were doing some dream interpretations with each other, just sharing different dreams and themes that we have. And I kept trying to interpret. My daughter was asking, my 27-year-old daughter was asking, Emma, she kept asking about perspective, about childhood, and how this dream may or may not fit into childhood. And I kept offering my perspectives, and she kept saying, that's not quite the right fit. It doesn't fit. And I realized after this exercise of talking about her for 15 or 20 minutes that I'm too close to it. In fact, just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I asked JD Gill about something with her own son and her perspective, and she answered with those words. I actually got those words from her. She says, I think I'm too close to it. I can't see it. When you are the context, and as a parent, you are a primary feature of the context, there is a blindness that comes with that. You can't see certain things. Like I always reference, the fish is the last to discover water. And so she talks about needing others, outsiders, psychotherapists specifically. It could be a sponsor, it could be a mentor, teachers, other cultures can provide us some perspective and some sight that we can't get from an inside view. This particular quote I'm about to share with you and read to you, in a way, is my favorite quote of the entire broadcast. In the context of talking about contexts, Jamie wrote, talking about a specific client, he did not know his background had been so terrible. And I think that might be the most vivid way to explain what psychotherapy is like. I say it in a humorous way when I wrote in one of my books that when clients tell me that they had a good childhood, I jokingly say, psychotherapy can fix that. And I will tell you this, it's not about shame or judgment or blame, because our old context teaches us that this quote is about that, and it's not. It's about being human. It's not about blame or looking for excuses. It's about describing what happened. Sometimes when I talk about parenting, I do underemphasize peer groups. I think siblings are underrepresented when we talk about contexts of growing up. There's the culture, there's the media, there are a whole lot of contexts. And sometimes when I talk about parenting, and I'll use a lot of quotes from the literature that reference mother much more than father, I will have others, particularly women, saying to me that I'm playing that old game where I'm blaming women, blaming mothers for the problems of their children. And women in our culture are already so laden with shame and guilt for any mistakes that they make, or not even any mistake that they make, but any mistake that their child makes, because they've been taught that it's kind of a simple cause and effect relationship. And I've had to reflect upon that because I'm a man, right? I'm not a woman. So I have had to reflect on that. And as I've reflected on that and talked to other women mentors and teachers, including Jamie Gill, one thing I've become clear about is I, I'm paying attention to what is. And still in our culture, mothers are the primary caregivers more often than not. And with that, we can't escape the fact that we dent our children. That we psychologically bruise them and dent them, and it doesn't lead to excuses and to a lack of accountability on the child's part. It leads to awareness. And if you could just imagine, just as a thought experiment, if you could imagine that shame and guilt didn't exist, or you had somehow overcome them, there'd be no reason for the defense, for the description. Oh, and by the way, I can spend hours and hours and hours talking about how fathers in these same families wound their children by their lack of presence, by their lack of emotional depth, by their strictness, by their focus on behavior, by their anger, by the fear that they evoke in their children. Those things are present also. But I love that quote. Doesn't even matter the context. This is ironic. He did not know his background had been so terrible. And I think what happens, this is going to be a little bit tough for new people, but I think what happens when you go to therapy long enough for it to take effect is you wake up to that. Things weren't normal, at least that. Things were worse than I thought. Now, why would children be generally inclined to minimize the terribleness of their childhood? Why would that happen? That doesn't make sense that children would consistently underestimate the terribleness of their childhood. And there's an answer for that. It's because the children are being asked to take responsibility for the parent's sense of self. I wrote in my most recent book that I'm waiting to hear back from the publisher about, specifically talking about a young man who grew up in a religious culture who came out as gay. I wrote in there that the darkest, deepest, most damaging secret that he kept was not his sexual attraction to other boys and later on men. But the most damaging secret that he kept was the feelings and the thoughts he had toward his parents and grandparents whom he lived with. And so those two things fit together. We are, as a rule, generally speaking, we are enrolled in the position of protecting our children, our parents from their issues of esteem and self-worth. A longer quote, Jamie writes, "A holding environment is one that is able to contain the child's productions in a welcoming way. The environment is not too narrow, nor is it too wide. In the spontaneous play that was able to occur in this holding environment, we learned to try things out, accept or reject them, modify them, and change them around. We were, in short, able to discover who we are. This served as the foundation for a sense of self. If our mothers and others delighted in this self, we felt it was welcomed in the world." Winnicott, one of my very favorites, claimed that it was important that as the baby emerges from primary identification between self and other, that's a very early stage in our development, is understanding that there's a difference between self and other, that as the baby emerges from primary identification between self and other, he or she is able to find himself or herself in the face of the mother. That is, the mother must be attuned to the baby and acknowledge the child's own being. I was giving a similar lecture yesterday to our staff, our wilderness staff, during our weekly in-service. I was saying to them, trauma is a big deal. When we think about big T trauma, right? Getting bullied, having a learning disability, being sexually assaulted. Those are real important traumas to pay attention to. But in a sense, there's something more fundamental or important than any one of those events. And that is the shape and the feel and the nature of the context. Children that suffer a trauma like the ones I just described, the events I just described, do significantly better when the context is able to respond to them in a healthy way around that trauma, where they're allowed to talk about feelings and difficult things and anger and rage and hurt and sex. Those kinds of environments that allow for those kinds of discussions turn that big T trauma into something that the child can integrate and move forward with. It's not that it doesn't affect them. It's just that it doesn't have the same kind of damaging effect. So what I'm saying is, in a way, that the big T trauma or the traumas that we talk about are less important than the attachment, the style. You know how if you buy an aquarium for say a snake, I don't know a lot about animals, but I've been told this. So, or it could be a certain type of fish, and the size of the aquarium will have a direct effect on the size to which the animal grows or the fish grows. At least that's what I've been taught. It's very similar to our attachment. We are the aquarium. We parents. In fact, More precisely, our minds, what goes on inside of our heads, is the aquarium. And so how we think and feel about the child, how we respond to the child, in every little moment of the day does more to impact the child, including when they go through these traumatic events, than anything else. We parents determine their shape or size, if you will. So that's why we talk about attachment so much. That's why we're an attachment based therapy program. That's why I'm an attachment based therapist, because we don't have control over all those traumas. We really don't. Somebody could be assaulted by a stranger or by even an ex-partner or an uncle or an aunt. More often than not, it's a male. Somebody could be bullied at school in situations where we're not there to defend them or protect them. A parent can die of a disease like cancer or develop alcoholism and the behaviors that come along with that. We can't control those things. What we can control is how we are with them. So as I explained to the staff yesterday, if you are different, if you can have a different perspective, a vantage point, if you can relate to the child and their mistakes and their behaviors in a different way, they will find themselves a different person when they look at you. They will feel differently about themselves because of the way that you feel about them. It's why I am so passionate about the myth that says that we shouldn't seek for self-esteem outside of ourselves. That just is based on some kind of pop psychology idea that has no grounding in what we know about child development. The key is not looking for or looking for reinforcement or validation outside of yourself. The key is finding people in your life that can support and see and validate all of you, the whole self, not just the pretty, talented, accomplished parts, the smart parts, but all of you, the mistakes, that they can hold space for it, be non-reactive to it. You know, when your child, all of you who are parents will remember this, even if you're not, you've seen this happen. Child's playing on their little scooter and they fall down. And what do? They look back at their closest caregiver. And what they're looking for is information about how they should feel about falling down. Do you see it? Just substitute falling down on a scooter with being sexually assaulted. The child looks back at the mother and father after experiencing a sexual assault to find out how they should feel. And if the parent is attuned, has done their work, the parent is capable of seeing the child and letting the child be who they are, feel what they feel, rather than thinking about it in terms of the right way to feel. And because the parent, most likely because of that role, that perspective, wants the child not to suffer, not to be in pain, the child will have a dog in the fight, if you will. They'll want the child not to feel it. And this will not be a conscious thought, but rather an unconscious thought. And so the child might learn or might be inclined to not feel anything. But of course, that's not the truth. That's the false self that just ensures that the parent can survive it. She does talk about peers in this first chapter on contexts. It's a series of essays on different subjects, all relating back to the context. And she says, by the time we entered school, a great amount of training and development had taken place. We were radically different when we sat in class. Even though we may have come from similar situations, we were actually from different countries. As you do this work, you'll begin to see and feel with more precision everything. You know, in The Knight in Rusty Armor, that wonderful allegory about waking up, when he cries and the visor falls off, rusts off of his face, and he can feel the air for the first time on his face. He can feed himself. He starts to hear the grass growing and the animals talking to him. And all of that magic is a metaphor that when we feel, or as we feel, as we wake up to what's going on inside of us, we hear and feel so much more around us. I can't overstate this. That's why the work at Evoke is so different, because the solution is not in the child's behaviors and how to manage it. I was explaining to the staff yesterday, if you understand this work and what we're trying to do, and you see the child differently, not in terms of good and bad, right and wrong, good or evil, but in terms of hurt, wounded, healing, courageous, afraid. If you start to see through the lens of psychology, of human development, or what we know about it so far, it changes the way you respond to them. I have a much different response to somebody if I think they're evil versus somebody who I think is scared and hurt, even though the behaviors might be the same. And so I long and I urge to drop from the paradigm of good and evil, so that ironically I can have more compassion and capacity for the people that I love and care about and come in contact with. A parent said to me years ago, "Aren't some parents just asses?" She said. I think her word was even a little bit more graphic than that. And I listened and paused, and I understood where she was coming from, because I've been there. And I just said to her, we were driving out to the field together. I said, I just don't have the luxury of thinking of people in those terms. Otherwise, I have to think of myself that way. So we start to wake up and we start to see things that we couldn't see before. And like Jamie's describing here, is when we get in those other contexts, we start to see that the whole world, the whole paradigm can and is often dramatically different. Jamie talks about strict father families, which is something they talk about in family and child development literature a lot. Strict father families. It's a certain type of family where it's the father is an autocrat. It doesn't even have to be a father. It can be a mother, just like when I talk about mothers, it can be a father. But rules matter, obedience matters, getting it right matters, being good matters. And she writes, the goal of these families is obedience. One learns how to follow and comply. These are highly valued. Thus, the emphasis is not on personal development. One is required to be a good kid, and the good kid is never the real kid, she writes. Opposed to this is the nurturing parent family. Here, the goal is to help members realize who they are and be that person. As I was preparing for this today, I was thinking to myself, I used to think when I was younger, I used to admire monks, people who meditate off by themselves in the mountains or in a monastery. In fact, I've said many times that if I could live multiple lives, one of my lives I would want to live would be to be a monk. I just don't know how you would learn some of those lessons without dealing with family. Because family relationships, partner relationships, parent-child relationships require sacrifice and compromise. And all of you have this question. The questions are, what's the curfew? What's the right curfew? How much screen time is the right screen time? What if my child wants a piercing and they're 14 years age? Should I let my child drink some? Because all the kids are doing it and they need to let all of those questions about what should I do, that all of you come here, at least at the start, within your heads. All of those questions come from the old way. And you have to kind of figure out what feels right to me, what makes sense to me. When am I a doormat where I don't take care of myself, and when am I being too rigid where I'm not considering the other person? When can I be flexible, and when should I stand firm? And because this is so important, what I'm about to say, and because in my opinion psychotherapy is really about becoming who you are, I can't answer those questions for you. It's not a technique. It's embracing what is, which is the goal is to become who you are and to live that life. No one has perfect parents, she writes. They're like teeth. No one has perfect teeth, and you need them. I misquoted that a little bit. I love that she talked about parents like teeth. I've never heard the analogy before this book, because nobody has perfect teeth. There's no such thing as perfect teeth, right? We just need them to do a job and be good enough. We need to attend to them. And parents are like teeth. We are like teeth. Our children don't need us to be perfect, or even good for that matter, and the traditional sense of the word good. And if they did need us to be perfect or good in the traditional sense, then they're doomed. As are we, as are our grandchildren and our parents and our grandparents. What our children need is human parents, real parents. Speaking of societal context, Jamie says, first, the world is divided into myself and those people. She talks about this process of what's happening in our society. Second, I project the parts of myself I don't want to recognize onto those people. This is the creation of us versus them, or othering, as I usually call it. Third, this system is institutionalized. When I divide the world into myself and those people, I am the only individual. They are a group. Second, I scapegoat my shortcomings onto them. Thus, I am good and they are bad. When this becomes the way that society functions, it is institutionalized. I've told this story once or twice. There was something that happened a few years ago where somebody that I knew and had been close to at one time tried to, and accomplished it, tried to hurt me, tried to do harm to me. And I was at one point, I bumped into a mutual friend that we had shared at a professional meeting. And the woman, the mutual friend, the woman said to me, I don't know how you forgive this person. She said to me, I'm not as big of a person as you. And I said, I really don't think it's about being a big person in the traditional sense. I said, I know that what that person did to try to hurt me came from a place of fear and hurt. And in a way of speaking, I forgave them immediately, even as they were doing it and saying what they said. And part of the reason that I did that, it wasn't a conscious choice. I didn't try to do that. Again, that's where that should voice comes in, right? Like, it wasn't the right thing to do, or the pious thing to do, or the enlightened thing to do. None of those thoughts occurred to me ever. It was a matter of survival. Among other things, I realized that I do the same things to people in my life. When I'm hurting or scared or angry or sad, I bleed on people that didn't cut me also. And so I had to decide, and it all happened in an instant. I had to decide whether or not to hate both of us, because we were both the same. And I decided that hating both of us was too great of a burden for me to bear. I had already, again, it was internalized. I just saw them the way that I was learning to see myself. That's what it was. This othering that she talks about is the opposite of that. It's believing the fantasy that the others are different. Maybe it's their skin color. Maybe it's their sexual orientation, or their culture, or their age. I wrote last week on social media, I wrote that, when children are unable to get their needs met, they act out. And then I wrote, and we are all children. Again, what I'm teaching you or talking about on this broadcast and all the broadcasts is not how you do parenting. It's giving you an idea about thinking about it a certain way. I can't tell you how much screen time. It wouldn't make sense. I can't tell you how much screen time you should have or your children should have. Those ideas don't make sense to me. What I can tell you is that as you develop, become a bigger person, become more aware, heal your own trauma, sort out your own wounding, make sense out of your own contexts, get an outside perspective. As you do all of that, You'll have more access to your creativity, to your tools, to your insight, to yourself. You'll be able to see your children better. That's what this work is. You'll be able to see your partner, your friends better. JD writes, this family operated according to, she's describing a specific family, the strict father family kind of family. She wrote, this family operated according to a common myth that the family is both the center of and more important than any other thing. That is, the family comes first. One's primary duty is to the family. Where this myth originated was never explained. It was just assumed this is the way that things were done. There is a myth in our culture that families should come first, and you don't have to do you don't have to do much thinking to realize how insane that idea is. Everybody within the sound of my voice can come up with a limitless number of examples, maybe even real ones from their own life, of families where if the children followed the family's ethics, the child would become a disaster as they grew up. So part of why I say that if my children just said, Dad, I need you out of my life to be healthy, and my response would be, well, I support that 100%, is because if I ask my children for something that I need that they don't, I would encourage them not to be around me at all. And again, I'm not talking about daily compromise and sacrifice like I was mentioning. That's a part of the dance. We don't invoke the nuclear option when we disagree about what we're going to have for dinner. But if I have to belong to your political party or to your religious group, or if I have to adhere to your ideas of what sexual norms should or ought to be, yeah, if I have to feel what you think I should feel, if I have to see my childhood the way that you see my childhood, it's not good for me. It's not good for them. And I think one thing I want to think about, one thing I want to offer to you this evening, as I think about context and clarity, and then some of the essays that I'll talk about with blindness that she talks about. You don't know what it was like for your child growing up. And no two children in the world ever have the same parents or the same childhood. That's how subtle and nuanced this process is. And so when your child says, Dad, you yelled at me too much, Mom, you nagged me, whatever the complaint is, they might not be crystal clear and on it, but they're trying to find it. And you telling them that that's not the way it was isn't helpful. And I've done that many, 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 many times. I still do it now and again because that's my gut reaction. We try to find the child's context to understand them, because we can't understand contexts. We can't understand anything very well at all outside of its context. The problem with these strict father families is that they function on demands. The difference between requests and demands may be characterized easily. If it's a request, no is an acceptable answer. This is when she's describing a middle-aged woman having to take care of her ailing parents, and the guilt and the shame and the manipulation that occurred around that, and how absolutely taxing and toxic it was for this woman to be in the context of those demands. They were not requests. She talks about them. She doesn't use the phrase narcissistic families, but I liked it. She said, I've heard some people, I mentioned this earlier, I have heard some people say that resisting such families, expectations or demands, is an instance of narcissism. I think the new movie, Turning Red, is a little bit about this. right? It's a young girl whose family tradition was very entrenched, and she was supposed to follow everything, and she begins to rebel and come into her own. You're only thinking about yourself, parents will say. But rather than being an instance of narcissism, it is an instance of mental health. Pressure, coercion, and manipulation of others is not an instance of successful functioning, even if everyone in the neighborhood behaves that way. I was saying to to the staff of your proverbial children. I know they're not literally your children, but I was saying to our wilderness field staff yesterday, the children that we're seeing are the Elsas from Frozen. They are the Elsas of the world. I don't know the character's name in Turning Red, but they're that little girl. And yes, they're acting out, and yes, they're rebellious, and yes, they're resisting and they're fighting, and they're trying to make you miserable and you fail. That's for sure. One of the things I taught to the staff that I'll offer to you parents also, which is the child is trying to get the caregiver or the staff to feel how they feel: powerless, scared, angry, frustrated. And so I explain you have to still follow the rules. You still have to have the structure of the program. Not only am I not giving you permission to not do that, I'm explicitly telling you it is your job to reinforce our policies and our procedures and our structure in the program. But you can think about them in these loving, compassionate ways, and it will change the relationship. It will change how they feel. They will find in your eyes, right? Like the child who falls on the scooter and they look back. They will find in your eyes an acceptable and loving version of themselves. Talking about behavior, talking about diagnoses, Jamie writes, this follows the logic of grammar and language. Speaking of behavior, language has meaning within context. In similar fashion, behavior has meaning within contexts. If somebody stands alone in a field and yells trinket, we don't know what he or she means. We don't know what's going on. It could be a game. We don't know enough about the context. Similarly, if someone stands alone in a field and bows repeatedly, we don't understand what he or she is doing. Again, we need more context. The job of a parent, a therapist who helps parents, a spouse. You know, when I'm dealing with an individual and they're talking about their partner, I will often offer diagnostic information about the spouse based on the story that I'm hearing. Again, not to blame or pick on them, but just to explain how they're dented, to help the individual that I'm talking with understand that they're not crazy, but not knowing the context, they feel crazy. It's our job to go and find the child's context. When I say child, I can't, again, I can't underscore this too much. I mean person. I'm a child, you're a child. And here's the mistake that parents make. This is where it really it comes together. You don't know their context unless they tell it to you. You think you do because you're looking at the same, so to speak, objective information, but that's not the way that this works. And so when your child tells you, this is the way my childhood was, and you were there the entire time, and you don't see it that way, that's your blindness. They're trying to tell you a story. Think of it as they're telling you a dream about themselves, or a fairy tale, or a short story. They're trying to tell you about their context so that their feelings make sense. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said it this way. He said, if we could read the secret histories of our enemies, we would find in each person's story enough suffering to disarm all hostility. In other words, if we could see somebody's context we wouldn't think them evil, no matter how hurtful their acts are. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't be put in jail if they hurt people. I'm not saying that. Again, it's not doesn't get translated into that. It's a different feeling. We might put them in jail and then we might visit them, in a manner of speaking. I call these next few slides seeing. She called it blindness, but I think it's the same point. She said every perception has a blind spot, the area that cannot be seen because it is part of the mechanism of perception itself. In other words, you can't see anything because your own vision is part of the mechanism of understanding. And you have to have an outside perspective to get perspective. The unconscious is the unthought known. This idea. It comprises what we have excluded from consciousness. Perhaps we have forgotten it. Perhaps we have vigorously repressed awareness. Perhaps it is a truth we refuse to accept, even to the point of needing to push its awareness away. It is important to manage what is allowed to be known in order to maintain the kinds of lives we have. There are secrets and off-limit topics in every family. Some of these are known and ignored. Some of these are denied and ignored. Some of these remain unknown and ignored. The secret may be that the parents cannot be criticized. It may be that what goes on in the home cannot be told to anybody. When parents ask me or partners ask me, are they lying? Are they telling the truth? It's gray. Those lines are blurry, more blurry than, I hear people try to say, well, lying is consciously, intentionally knowing that you're not telling the truth, and denial is something else. It's less clear to me. It's less clear to me. The unconscious known. I don't know if it's known and ignored or repressed as a matter of survival. As children, we are taught and assume that what goes on in the home is ordinary. It is how it should be. This is always bad training. What goes on at home is what goes on at home. It is not a template for what goes on in the world. The child learns a way to see the world filtered through the psychological structure of his or her parents, who are often as infantile as the child in their worldview. Parents who are capable of resonant love, of attuned love connection, on the other hand, seek to join with the emotions of the child and provide a welcome and safe environment. The important point is that the child will, by and large, think his or her childhood is ordinary. It is the way life is. And she makes this point often in her writing and her teaching. It is not. It is not a normal childhood. I heard a very benign example of this recently. There's a new recent documentary that's out about Paul McCartney. It's a 3-part series. It's not the one that Peter Jackson did with the entire Beatles, but it's a contemporary piece that I don't remember who did it, but this one-on-one interview of McCartney going through all of his music, his writing, and so forth. And there's a point in there where Paul says to the person interviewing, he said, I thought all families were like mine until I got out into the world. I thought all families were loving and supporting and kind, because that's apparently the kind of family that he grew up in, of differences and of artistic expression. And it wasn't until I got out in the world that I realized that every family is not like that. And it doesn't matter. That's where I go back to. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how good your childhood was. And in terms of being able to be a healthy partner to your spouse, or a healthy parent to your parent. That's not the indicator. That's not the variable that predicts it. The variable that predicts your ability to be a healthy partner, be a healthy participant in relationships, specifically relationship with the child, is how much You've excavated your own childhood, how well you've come to examine critically your own story. And so, even in Paul McCartney's example of assuming that the entire world was loving, do you see how that could harm people? Do you see how not even not knowing about trauma and all of its various common forms in families would lead you to be not compassionate, would lead you to be judgmental and abrupt? The problems and the distortions are endless. Jamie writes, why is avoiding the truth a basic necessity? It is because I'm surrounded by people who cannot tolerate the truth. Their sense of self is constructed on defenses arrayed against the truth. They cannot tolerate what is real, so they employ defenses to keep them from seeing what is real. This improves their sense of self-esteem. These people are struggling to be worth something, and their truth keeps them from this goal. In short, she writes, blindness comes from seeing one's own and no one else's view. Blindness prevents empathy. This is considered a virtue in some areas. By far, the most difficult blindness is the one that is not known. Further, unidentified blindness has no way of being corrected. Because if you don't know that you don't know, there's no reason to change. This idea, when I wrote in The Audacity to Be You, that to understand other people, you have to lose your mind, this is what I was talking about. When the child comes and tells you, or the partner comes and tells you, here's my experience of you, you have to have somewhat of an intact sense of self and esteem. You have to have grown up and become an adult to be able to sit and listen to them. But because many of us aren't, or at times of stress, we're not capable of accessing that strength, we react with defensiveness and we argue and we point out that they're being selfish or self-centered, that they don't understand, that they're not being honest. We tell them that they're making it up. The more work that you do, the more you'll be able to see not just your children and your partner, but everybody. That's the work. A couple of longer quotes before I wrap up. As she talked with me over a few sessions, Jamie's talking about, I was struck by how wonderful she had painted herself. This is about a young woman, or a woman, I should say, who was in a failing marriage and did not want it to fail. As she talked with me over a few sessions, I was struck by how wonderful she had painted herself to be. And yet there was an unmistakable sense of sadness and pain about her. I heard the wonderful message, but I felt the sadness and pain. This was a person who had not been genuinely heard as a child. She became a construction of her own making in order to survive, and then she spent her life perfecting that construction. Her focus was really on herself. She held advanced degrees. She had blazed herself into a professional position. She was trying to have the perfect life. Not having experienced empathic connection as a child, she focused instead on achievements. This held up her self-esteem. She was actually in charge of everything in her marriage, and she was angry her husband would not come closer to her. It did not occur to her that he was likely afraid of being consumed by her. Somebody told me this week that somebody reached out to me about these broadcasts on the podcast platform and said that the reason they like my teaching is because I insert myself as one who struggles with all of these things. And I was glad to hear that that made a difference for her. This woman is me or you. This is this quote could be part of the thesis of The Audacity to Be You, the book that I wrote. When we spend all of our energy trying to be this good thing, this lovable and wonderful thing, then our ego and our interactions with our children prevent us from hearing their anger and their sadness and their hurt and their disappointment and their frustration. We have no room for that information, right? Because that information threatens the essence of what we think we're supposed to be worthy of life and love and happiness, of God's love, of our parents' love, of another person's love. So it's only in deconstructing this idea about trying to be good and learning that the real task is trying to be who we are that we can have success. And this woman and all of her accomplishments and achievements found it impossible of seeing her husband and his fear and her participation in that, because she wasn't able to incorporate any of the quote unquote badness into her. She had to be good. And that need to be good prevented intimacy. Here's the conclusion I want to share with you for part one of my two-part broadcast. Every day, Jamie says, we look out and see the same world. It never occurs to us to question what might be affecting what we're able to see. It is a bit like looking through a tube. The tube restricts what we're able to see. We don't think of putting the tube down because we have been taught or learned that looking through a tube is the proper way to see. In this way, over and over, we confront the same world, and the world seems to be the same place it always was. Our own contribution to this process of seeing the same thing goes unexamined until, that is, we work with a therapist. The therapist has not been trained to see with our tube. The therapist wonders why we're always looking through a tube. It's the way it is done, we say. The therapist wonders where our notion of tubes came from. Whose idea was tubes? And even more importantly, what is it tubes allow us not to see? What are we not seeing about ourselves, about our mothers, and about our fathers? I believe in evoke therapy programs. I believe in our wilderness program for children. I believe it's a wonderful service and opportunity to help children that are struggling and their parents. And I believe a great deal of that healing is for everybody in the family to realize just this, that they've been looking through a tube the entire time. And that's not the real world. That's just the world that the family needed us to see, that mom and dad needed us to see, that our culture needed us to see, that our teachers, that our siblings, that our contexts needed us to see. All right, that's the end of part one. I'm going to do part two. Like I said, coming up, we'll have a question and answer next in our next broadcast, where I'll take any questions on this or any other topic, and then I'll do part two. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Amazon and Audible. We have 3 charitable organizations that we belong to. If you want to give to organizations that help families and children in the field of mental health, we belong to Choose Mental Health. You can go to choosementalhealth.org, or Sky's the Limit. Go to sky'sthelimitfund.org, or the Evoke Family Foundation, which is specifically a smaller foundation to help the work move forward. Go to evokefamilyfoundation.org. We have support groups. Any current or former wilderness family can attend the support group March 24th. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is our next one. We have one a month. It's just for alumni, so people that are a little bit farther along on the journey. April 26th, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time will be our next available alumni-only meeting. And then we have an intensive support group each month online, April 12th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Just contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, if you want to get outside of your context and get some help, I can't, all of you. The best way that I know how to do this is by doing a therapy, first of all. And a great start for that is a therapeutic intensive. So our version of it is called Finding You. The next available offering in person is April 20th through 24th. June 24th through 26th is online. It's an online offering. Is a very, very similar program. Just contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. If you've attended Finding You, We have an upcoming Returning to You, which is kind of a part 2. Those will be facilitated by Emma Reedy and Alex White. Wonderful, wonderful facilitators. May 11th through 15th. Those of you who have met them know that I'm telling the truth. We have coaches available for parents and anybody who would like some help in this area. These coaches are attachment-based therapy instructed coaches, so they can help you in line with what we're talking about. We have pursuit trips for adults and families, 3 to 30 days, anywhere in the world, customized, fun activities, therapeutic adventure activities that have kind of a light therapeutic support system to them. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org for classes and resources in your area that are free. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast. We're going to be at 2 million listens in about 10 days. SoundCloud.com. You can also go to on your computer and search and search there also. You can find Evoke and myself, Brad, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy, or Evoke Intensives is on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And then we have a blog with new content each week that is wonderfully curated by Malia, who's also the moderator for these broadcasts. My next broadcast will be March 29th. At 6:30 p.m. That'll be an open forum. If you want to invite family, friends, siblings to this or ask questions about them and for behalf of them, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to share with them the link and have them show up to this broadcast to ask questions live. Thank you for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope this gives you a glimpse into the work that Jamie talks about in her book, Contexts. I can't wait to do part 2 with you. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.